John 11. John 11. As you're turning there, let me make one quick note, and I'll try to remember to say this again at the end of class. Next time, it has us covering the rest of Luke 17. I'd like to add the first 14 verses of chapter 18 into that as well. So those aren't supposed to be until the next time, but we're just going to cover the end of Luke 17 and just the very beginning of Luke 18. I'll put some questions up, Lord willing, at the end of class, and so that'll be on there, but I just want you to note that on the schedule. All right, so tonight we're in John chapter 11. The book of John is somewhat known for its 7 signs that are in the book, starting with Jesus turning the water to wine. You'll remember some of the other signs: healing the paralytic in chapter 5, feeding the 5,000 in chapter 6, healing the blind man in chapter 9. Those are some of the signs that he works, but there's basically 7 total through the book, with the exception that the resurrection is not included in that 7. So there's 7 I am statements. I am the bread of life. I am the vine. I am the door. I am the shepherd. All of those good things that he mentions. John chapter 11 kind of finishes up the signs as far as those demonstrations. There will be at least one more I am statement after this, at least in John 14. I'm trying to think of others. But my point here is that this chapter in John chapter 11 really does serve as kind of wrapping up this section of the book of John. It seems to me that what we've got is John chapter 1 really as an introduction, then John 2 through 11 as a series of signs indicating that Jesus really is who the introduction says that he is. And then chapter 12, if you'll flip over there just real quickly, we won't get to chapter 12 this quarter. We only have like 5 classes left or something like that, maybe less. And so notice Jesus, therefore, 6 days before the Passover. You see that? 6 days before the Passover. That's his final week. All right, so we are going to, basically, John 11 is the last chapter in the book of John that we'll look at. Because what's going to happen, if you'll notice, go back to the end of chapter 10, he was on the far side of the Jordan, right? That's called Perea. He was on the far side of Jordan. And he's coming back. And what we see in Matthew 19, where we're going to spend a good bit of our time over the next few weeks, is going to be basically on a journey from Perea back towards Jerusalem, right? It's going to kind of be a path towards the city. And so what we're going to have in chapter 11 is him coming to Bethany that we're going to see. And then really the rest of it is kind of focusing on going towards Jerusalem. And then we get to the final week for sure. So anyway, all of that is to say is that John 11, I think we will see it in the text, that its place in the book, it fits with the contents of the chapter, because we are kind of reaching a high point or a low point, however you want to view that as we go. So when I talk about John 11, we're talking about within weeks of Jesus arriving in Jerusalem, maybe even nearer than that. Maybe we're talking about days. Because this closing ministry period, that's what we've been calling this period of time, is about 6 months long. And I think we're just right at the end of that, just within days of the final week. Any questions or comments about that? And you'll see some of that more as we continue to talk. Anything we need to say as we jump into chapter 11? Okay, so why don't we go ahead and get started? And what I'd like to do is just read a little bit. And let's see. Let's read all the way through verse 16. It'll take us a little while to talk through all that, but it's kind of all one continual conversation. So now a certain man was sick, Lazarus from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. And it was the Mary who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. But when Jesus heard this, he said, this sickness is not to end in death, but is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified by it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was sick, he stayed 2 days in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and you are going there again?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him." And he said these things, and after that he said to them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go so that I may awaken him." The disciples then said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will be saved from his sickness." Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he was speaking of actual sleep. So Jesus then said to them plainly, "Lazarus is dead, and I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, so that you may believe. Let us go to him." Therefore Thomas, who is called Didymus, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go, so that we may die with him." All right, there's a lot of interesting things, I think, that are going on in this text. First of all, they are going to the city of Bethany, which is just on the east side of Jerusalem, maybe like not even a day's walk. It's accessible to the city of Jerusalem. And we have this reference to Mary, who anoints Jesus' feet with her perfume and then wipes it with her hair. Now, will you notice, going back to chapter 12 again, that's where we get that story, right? We don't get the story until after we get the way she's described. And what I would say is, it seems to me that John maybe is assuming one or two things, maybe both. One, that people already know the story, right? I think that would be appropriate given what Jesus said. Anyway, given that Jesus is so complimentary of her, that was a story that would go around. The other thing is I wonder if people are not supposed to be reading the book of John regularly and meditating on it. I think that's the way that Bible books are meant to be done, is that we read it to where we kind of know what's coming, and he anticipates that right here in John chapter 11. So the sisters send to him, and what does it say about them that they send to Jesus because Lazarus is sick? What does that say? They believe, right? They know that Jesus can do something about this. And I think the way they frame it is they assume that Jesus will do something about this, right? Jesus, the one whom you love, is sick. That's it, period. Okay, he's hitching up the donkey and they're headed that way or whatever. He's coming right then. Now, notice what Jesus says to his disciples. How was this how was this sickness going to end? Not in death, but in God's glory. All right. Now, as we follow this story, it's going to be like, wait a second. But remember, we're not talking about the steps along the way. We're talking about the end, right? And because in some way you might say, well, this sickness does end in death. No, it's not, right? It's not over yet. And so we need to keep that in mind as we go. Anything there?
Do you think this is the same Mary and Martha from Luke 10?
I believe it is. Yeah, I would think so. Yeah, for sure. I think all the things line up. Mary, Martha. I think they're in. Is it mentioned they're in Bethany in Luke 10?
Yeah, I couldn't find the location.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I would take it to be the same. It's interesting that Lazarus is not mentioned there in Luke 10, but he wasn't really part of that conversation, so I guess there was no need to bring him up.
But the other thing that I want to mention is you see there that Jesus loved this family. He loved Lazarus. He loved Mary. He loved Martha. And we'll see as the story goes on that he's overcome with emotion. So we don't need to forget that as he's nearing the end of his life, that he is a human, that he has emotion, that he feels pain and agony. And he's not a robot that was sent here to do a mission. And I think of the Terminator sent to protect the Connor lady, and that was his job. There was no emotion, there was no attachment. He was here just to protect her and to fulfill the mission. Jesus wasn't like that. So as he's nearing the cross, he's feeling these things just as we would. The agony, the emotional strain of what he's going through, the pain of seeing people upset and hurt. So let's not forget that he is a human at this point, and he's carrying all these emotions that we would carry too.
Yeah. So I love that point. So notice it says in verse 5, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. What's the next word for you in verse 6? So, right? Isn't that interesting? Right? He loved them, so he waited. I could have guessed that it would say he loved them, but he waited. But that's not what it says. He loved them, so he waited. There is something that's going to be beneficial to them by him waiting, right? That his waiting is a result of his love for them. I think we can see them gain something in all of this. And I think that's interesting. I wonder, and I wouldn't make any I wouldn't base my whole belief on this, but I wonder if sometimes the things that we experience and we say, if God loved me, he wouldn't let me go through this. I wonder if Mary and Martha thought that, right? If Jesus loved us, he would already be here. And when maybe one day they got a chance to read John chapter 11, right? I don't know. Maybe they heard Jesus explain at some point. He loved them, so he waited. And because on the far side of their waiting, there would be a benefit. That's a pretty powerful thing to see. That we not only do we not understand always why God does or does not do something in our lives, we don't actually know whether or not he is waiting because of his love for us or something like that. So I think that's helpful. So then he says to his disciples, let's go to Judea again. Now, what's their reaction to the idea of going to Judea? Dangerous. That's exactly right. We were just there, and what were they trying to do to him? Stone him. Yeah. So if you go back to John chapter 10, remember this is in verse 30. So verse 30, I and the Father are one. The Jews picked up stones again to stone him, right? Like this isn't the first time. Again, they pick up stones. And so then he criticizes them. And in verse 39, they were seeking again to seize him, and he eluded their grasp, right? So he's already just escaped. He goes to beyond the Jordan where there's a little bit of a cushion, right? There's a little bit of breathing room. And now he's going to turn right back around and go back. And the disciples say, Jesus, they were just about to kill us there. And what's his reaction to that? What does he say? Yes. So basically, he responds to that saying that I think the essence of what he's saying is there is work to do, right? And if you go with me, it's going to be all right? I think that's the idea of walking in the light. If you'll follow, John 8, I am the light of the world. If you'll follow the light, then you won't stumble. But if you walk in the night, and I think that night is if you rely on your own thinking and you don't trust me, you're going to stumble, right? You're going to fall because of that. Is that how you take that, or you have a different sense?
And I think the lesson in that for us is the whole thinking that the world, as wicked as it is, and everything that's going on, we still have work to do. Mm-hmm. We can't use that as an excuse just to hide ourselves from the world. We have to know that there's work to do. We have to be lights in the world, and we have to go out, even though it's a dark and perverse world, we still have work to do. And we can't let what's going on around us say, hey, we're not going to do nothing because it's a scary place. Jesus says, they're trying to kill me, but there's still work to do.
Yeah, and I wonder if he's talking about his work, like he is going to be able to accomplish the work he's been called to do, and they need to stick with him. I think you're exactly right. Okay, anything else through verse, let's say verse 10? Any questions or comments on that so far? All right, so verse 11, he says, Lazarus is asleep, so I'm going to go wake him. Now, I like this. He says, our friend, right? You see that? Our friend, I need to go wake him. So he might be all of their friends, but they can't all go wake him up, right? And you would think 13 of them yelling Jesus into 12. Oh, wake up. That would that's what they think. They think he's just asleep, right? But when Jesus makes that distinction between our friend and I need to go wake him up, there's something that he's making a distinction there. And they didn't understand what he was saying because they think he's talking about literal sleep. They think, well, if he's able to rest, he's going to be fine. And Jesus says, he clarifies and says, he's not literally asleep. He's dead, but he's figuratively asleep because I'm going to go wake him up. And it's interesting there. I am glad for your sakes that I was not there so that you may believe, but let us go to him. So not only does it look like Mary and Martha are going to benefit from this, and Lazarus are going to benefit from this, but it looks like the disciples are going to benefit from the fact that Jesus waited to go, right? So there's multiple layers of benefit that are coming out of this. All right, anything through that verse?
I can see that conversation about them thinking that he's just asleep.
Because he's sick.
And
Yeah.
the conversations that I still have with Jackson today, but as a little kid, you know, where you say something and they take it literal, and
Yes.
then you're like, look, he died.
Mhm.
Like Jesus, like, look, you know, y'all ain't getting it. Lazarus is dead. Well, oh, okay. Well, that's, you know.
Yes, that's exactly right. Okay, look at verse 16. Who speaks in verse 16? Thomas. What's the nickname we have for Thomas? Doubting Thomas. All right, now, I think he won that nickname fairly. I understand that. But look what he says in verse 16. Let us go so that we may die with him. That's pretty bold for Doubting Thomas to say. So I realize that when the pressure is on, Thomas doesn't really come through in some way. But right here, when Jesus is getting ready to head towards Jerusalem, Thomas says, we're not going to let him go without us. We're going to go with him so that, you know, and we'll die with him. And I think that's a pretty tremendous statement for Thomas to say at that moment.
It sounds like Peter.
He does.
You know, Peter does the same thing.
That's right.
Denied his betrayal, and then the next morning, you know, reverse course.
That's right. That's right.
So what does that mean? Does that mean that, you know, we have moments in time where our faith is stronger and we're ready
Yeah.
for temptation, and maybe other times our guard is down and we're not so ready?
Yeah, I think about it like this potentially. I think they were ready to die, but I think they wanted to die fighting, right? Like I think Peter swings a sword in the garden, and I have to imagine they're outnumbered. I can't imagine that Peter thinks they're going to make it out of there, but he's going to fight, you know, and swinging for the head. So I wonder if it was when Jesus says, we're not going to fight back, if that's when it just kind of like struck them that, well, this is going to go a different direction than I thought it would. And I don't know what Thomas's thinking is right here. I'm wondering if he has strong faith at this moment. It is kind of a raw courage, right? Like we're going to march right in there no matter what happens. In some way, I don't think they were afraid of dying, but I think they were going to die fighting. And then when they're not allowed to, when it's just like, put down that sword, it's like, oh man, we're scattering now. So I don't know. You have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think with his crucifixion, the plug had been pulled on their faith, and they just, you know, didn't know what to do.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that probably indicates that they still kind of have a shallow understanding of the kingship and of the kingdom that's coming all the way along. But, I mean, I'm not sure I would have had any different concept standing on that side of it.
I think it goes back to the whole counting the cost of what true discipleship is. And we kind of get this quick reaction of, oh, I'm ready to go. I'm ready to go serve. I'm ready to go fight. And then we hadn't really counted the cost. And then when it gets to be a little more, it's like, hold up, like this is not exactly what I thought it was going to be. And we can do the same thing today. We can have a quick reaction of, you know, hey, we're ready to serve, but we ain't really thought about what it takes to truly serve.
Yeah, when the man says, I'll follow you wherever you go. It says, foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but I don't have anywhere to lay my head. We don't know how that guy responds, right? Like Jesus is saying, don't make a commitment. Well, you know, don't sit down. You know, if you're a king, you sit down and you count the number of troops you have with the ones that are coming. Or if you're going to build a tower, he wants us to assess what it's going to cost. And maybe that's what's not happening here. It's a good point. Does anybody else say something? Thomas, who is also called Didymus, does yours say something different? The twin. Yeah, the word is Didymus, but that was the word for twin. Now, I don't know who his twin brother was, okay. You want to take us from 17 on?
To go all the way to 31? Or
I have a break at 27, but you can go
Okay, well,
wherever you want.
mind. We'll go to 26. There.
And
It says,
27 is where my break is.
oh, okay, we'll go to the end of
If you
27. That's fine. It says, so when Jesus came, he found that he had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 15 stadia away. Many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. So then Martha, when she had heard that Jesus was coming, went to meet him, but Mary stayed in the house. Martha then said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Even now I know whatever you ask of God, God will give you. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise from the dead. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise in the resurrection on the last day. And Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even if he dies, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? She said, yes, Lord, I have come to believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, and he who comes into the world. So when he gets to Lazarus, remember he had delayed for 2 days, so Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. It basically says that he began to stink, like he's beginning, I guess, to rot away. So I'm not sure why the delay was there. Maybe it was to show that Jesus and that God had the full power of the resurrection. So, I read in certain studying, and it may not be true, but that the Jews believed that 3 days was kind of a special period, and on the 4th day, basically, the person was gone. And so maybe that's why Jesus waited, because he's going to show that he has power over all of nature and life.
We're kind of seeing different levels of Jesus raising. So like Jairus' daughter dies he's on the way there. The widow at Nain, right? They're at the funeral service, probably within a day. And now you have an even greater distance of 4 days. And I think you're right. I think there probably was some sense that it was, the nails in the coffin kind of thing.
Yeah, it was over. As far as the stadia there in verse 18, I had Jackson do this research, and I didn't check it, but he come back with 1.5 miles. Is that right?
I have 1.7, so that's pretty good.
Pretty good. We'll have to give him props on that. But, so very close to Jerusalem, and you see here in 20 and 22 the emotion of Martha. She's obviously emotional over the death, and she kind of comes to Jesus and she says, Lord, if you'd have been here, my brother would not have died. So you can see that she is emotional, but in the very next verse, you see that she still has faith. So I think that's a lesson for us today, that when we struggle with things in this world and we go through hard times, it's okay to be emotional. It's okay to be upset, but we can't lose our faith. It's okay to have these feelings, but we can't ever doubt or lose faith. And we see that in Martha, with that comment of, if you'd have been here, my brother would not have died. But even now you ask, God will give you. Like it's emotional and upset, but there's still faith and confidence in Christ and God. You got anything to that point?
No, sir. I think that's great.
So then we see there that he starts talking to him about the resurrection in verse 25. So he's referred to himself as, the bread of life, as the living water, as the door, as the gate, as the shepherd. I know I'm missing some, but all these things that he's referred that I am. And to me, this is probably one of the most powerful ones. He says, I am the resurrection. I am life. And so he kind of puts it all in a capsule there and puts it all together as, I'm Jesus, I am the resurrection, and whoever believes in me will not die but have eternal life. And I'm sure, as we've seen numerous times, that they probably didn't comprehend what he was meaning as he was saying that.
Well, it's interesting here because he says Lazarus will rise again, and she says, oh, I know, right, in the last day. And I think it seems to me that reflected a Jewish belief, a general Jewish belief, that there would be a resurrection. So this is Acts 23 and verse 8, talking about the Sadducees. There is no resurrection, no angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledged them all, right? So there was an awareness, and Paul will even say, I'm on trial for the resurrection, and that's going to lead to a divide in the council. But the interesting thing is here, he says Lazarus is going to rise again, and she doesn't doubt that. She says, I know he'll rise again. But Jesus, I think, is saying here, like you're saying, he was she had not evaluated what it was going to take for that resurrection to happen. And I wonder if we could ponder that for a second, because Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. So think about like 1 Corinthians 15. We talked about that not too long ago, where basically what Paul says is that it's because Jesus was raised from the dead that we have hope of being raised from the dead. So she's looking forward to the resurrection, but Jesus is saying, you don't really know what it's going to take to get there. It's going to take me. I am the resurrection and the life. And I think that's helpful here, because we're going to learn more about that as we go. But I think she just assumed, well, that's just something God's going to take care of. He was going to take care of it. But the plan was for Jesus to be raised from the dead. And that's how it was going to be executed.
The only other thing I had was in 27, you see, we've done talked about Jesus' true love for this family, and then you see her reaction, and you don't see many people with this kind of broad statement, but she says, you know, you are Christ, the Son of God, and he who comes into the world. So she had full faith in who he said he was, and all these signs that he had done. She's one of the people that actually saw it, believed it, and was willing to broadcast it out. Because at this point, there's the way I read it, there's a lot of people gathered up kind of for a funeral. So when she's saying these things, there could have been a lot of people here listening to this. So,
So interesting, he says, he who believes in me will live even if he dies. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die, ever. And so the emphasis that he's pointing here, he's not saying you won't die physically, right? Notice that at the end of verse 25, will live even if he dies. But what he's saying, one writer said it like this. I like this. Ordinary mortal life ebbs away. The life Jesus gives will never end. And I think that's a helpful way of thinking about it. Is that when Jesus says, you will never die ever, he's saying, even if you die physically, this life will end, but your real life will continue. And that's the emphasis here. And she says, I believe that. And that's another way in which we might say he's the resurrection and the life. He's the dividing line between who lives and who doesn't. By putting our confidence in him, that makes all the difference.
I think that's why he referred to Lazarus as sleeping too.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
it was not a true death. He was just asleep because he knew that he was going to rise. And the same thing with us. We know when we die on this earth physically, we're just kind of sleeping until, judgment day.
Well, and he asks her about her faith. And, John will say at the end of the book that he wrote these things so that we may believe on him and believe we might have life in his name. And I wonder if this is we're not quite to the conclusion of this section yet, but we're getting there. And Martha says, yes, I believe. And that is how she's going to have life. And that's we're going to come to that as well. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
She's completely written off that Jesus could raise him from the dead. Because, she says, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. So there's still a keeping of hope.
Yeah, I think there is. I think you're exactly right there. And
it is interesting that later on she'll be the one where he says something needs to be done. She has a little bit of pushback on that. I wonder if she's saying, I'm not doubting you. Yes. I don't know if she expects him to be raised from the dead.
I don't think she does, because later on when he tells her to remove the stone, she says it's been 4 days and he's like, it's open. He's stinking at this point.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I may be reading verse 22 a little differently. I may be reading it with the idea of like she knows there's hope. Like I would think her pushback in verse 39. Maybe I don't know. Yeah, that's a good contrast there. On first read, I would read verse 22 as her holding out hope that he could still do it. But then maybe in verse 39, she's being more realistic and say, I don't know, maybe she thought he needed to raise him before they moved the stone. I don't know. So he was.
I don't know that he was completely transparent with her on what his intention.
I think you're right about that.
And so,
because he says he will rise again. He doesn't say, I'm here to raise him.
Right.
Right. So
So I wonder if that kind of,
Yeah.
quenched her
maybe so.
hope a little bit at that point.
Yeah, because in verse 25 and 26, he talks about even if they die, they're going to live forever. And she's like, oh, okay. Yeah. So, yeah, maybe so. That's helpful.
But he also says, I am the resurrection.
That's right. Yeah. And you would have to know, I mean, I guess they would have had to know that he has done something like this before, right? Not to this extent, but he has raised dead people before. And I would assume Mary and Martha, of all people, would know that story.
Well, it's interesting. Thomas was there.
Mhm.
He saw this happen, and then he doubted Jesus.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. That's good. Yeah, which maybe shows the heartbreaking nature of his lack of faith at that moment. It's kind of like we've seen the disciples all along, like they see Jesus work miracles, but they don't draw the conclusion that he could do it again, like with the feeding of the 5,000 or whatever. That's interesting. Okay.
So,
Yeah, go ahead.
so I'll try to make
No worries.
Did we already talk about how it seems like Martha has learned lessons from the past? So like before, Martha was the one who was like, I'm tending to the people here, and Mary wasn't. It is interesting here that when Martha hears,
She goes.
she leaves the people
Mhm.
and is like, I'm going to go talk to
Mhm.
Jesus. I think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
She might have felt a responsibility to stay with him, but she didn't.
Yeah, maybe. I would see her maybe as the one who's more likely to press on Jesus. Right? Make her help me. If you'd been here, he wouldn't have died. Maybe she just has kind of that willingness to kind of say, do you not see what we're going through? Do you not see what I'm dealing with here? If you had been here, I wouldn't have to deal with this. That was kind of how I read it, but that may just be a reflection of the women in my life. I'm kidding. Okay. I'm dead. Okay. But he who dies will always live or something. Okay. All right. So, Mr.
No,
Carey,
you're
got
on your own.
Okay. Yeah. Verse 28. When she had said this, she went away and called Mary, her sister, saying secretly, the teacher is here and is calling for you. And when she heard it, she got up quickly and was coming to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha met him. Then the Jews who were with her in the house and consoling her, when they saw that Mary rose up quickly and went out, they followed her, thinking that she was going to the tomb to cry there. Therefore, when Mary came to Jesus, where Jesus was, she saw him and fell at his feet, saying, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw therefore her crying, and the Jews who came with her also crying, he was deeply moved in spirit and was troubled, and said, Where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. So the Jews were saying, See how he loved him. But some of them said, Could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man also from dying? So they call for Mary, and Mary goes, and Jesus hasn't arrived yet. The people that are in the house didn't seem to have heard the news of what happened. They just see Mary get up and go out. They think she's, emotionally distraught and going to the grave in order to mourn. But then she sees Jesus. I take it to be that John tells us that because I think they're following her. If she's going to the grave to mourn, they're going to go with her, which is why then it says when she came and saw where Jesus was, fell at his feet. And you also have all of these people around at that same moment. I think that's why John is telling us that. And she says basically just like what Martha had said, that if you had been here, he wouldn't have died, which maybe is true. But Jesus, I don't know that he's expressed this to them yet, but his delay was so that he would die, so that he would not just be sick when he came. And so when she's crying, they're crying, and he is deeply moved as well. And verse 35 is going to say Jesus wept. So I wonder what the weeping is over. And I think you indicated this a moment ago. And you can talk more about that.
It's just to me, with this love for this Mary, and she comes to you, and that's what she says is, Lord, if you'd have been here, he wouldn't have died. I can just, Jesus knows what he's about to do. Like, there's no doubt. He knows he's about to raise him from the dead, but he's still overcome with emotion to the point of weeping. And it has to be because of the heartache that he sees these other people going through. So that, once again, just confirms that he has true emotion that we would deal with today, that it's, like I said earlier, that he's not robotic, that it doesn't faze him, that he's deeply moved by this. So as he goes through these next moments of his life with the being, mistreated and spit on and beaten and all that, think about this, to where he's feeling true emotion. So for him to go through all that thing should be a sobering thought for us to realize that he's facing these things.
Yeah, that's right.
We're told to weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice.
So he sees the heartbreak. I think that's right. And so one thing I would say, look at verse 37. I think that's great. Weep with those who weep. And then, so in verse 37, there are people standing there that are saying, why wasn't he here? Couldn't he have done something about this? It's interesting. They admit that he healed the blind man. Couldn't he have helped this sick person? And so that's a frustrating position to be in for Jesus, because it's like these people know he has the power, but they are trying to read into his motives in a way that's like looking bad at him. And I wonder if that, verse 38, so Jesus, again, being deeply moved within. I wonder if that's a different being deeply moved, right? I wonder if it's a weeping in verse 35, but a frustration in verse 38. Like he's asking where he's laid, and they, instead of saying, I can't wait to see what he's going to do, say, well, why wasn't he here to help? I know he could have did something about it. He must not like these people. That's kind of the thinking behind them. So he says, remove the stone. We're going to go a little bit quicker. And she says, well, he's already been dead for 4 days. He's going to stink. And he says, didn't I say that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So they removed the stone. And Jesus raised his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. And I knew that you always hear me, but because of the crowd standing around, I said this so that they may believe you sent me. And when he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. The man who had died came forth, bound hand and foot with wrappings, and his face was wrapped around with a cloth. Jesus said to them, unbind him and let him go. Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to Mary and saw what he had done believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them the things which Jesus had done. So just a couple of things to notice here. The close connection between Jesus and the Father. Father, I know you hear me. You always hear me. But I'm saying this so that the people around me can know. And I think that's good. That Jesus, of course it's good because Jesus is doing it. But he's expressing his thinking as he goes so that the crowd around knows that this is that the Father is working through and with him. And this is going to cause two things to happen. One, people who had not believed before are going to believe now. Right there. This is an undeniable situation. But then people who are so hard-hearted that this isn't going to change them, they go and report it to the Pharisees so that the Pharisees know what's happening. And he's less than 2 miles away. He's within range.
And I think you see the whole setup here of why he delayed and why, when Thomas said, we're going to go back there because they're trying to stone you. We've seen him heal people from a distance. He told the one guy to go back home because, the healing was already done. He had done it from a different distance. So he could have raised Lazarus from the dead and never left. But all this is playing into why this is the greatest power, that he's showing here. So the crowds are there. Everybody's there. And that's kind of why I think he was delaying, is to show that this was the great ultimate power of the resurrection.
I think you're absolutely right. So, maybe we'll just take just a minute to say this. I think that this Lazarus situation is giving us lots of previews about what's coming. Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, saying he's the resurrection and the life, is building up to what's coming in his own resurrection. But I would say it previews Jesus' resurrection and it previews our resurrection, in the sense that Mary and Martha say, I know a resurrection is coming. And Jesus is saying, yes, but I think he's giving a preview here of the power that he has. Even when somebody is really dead, 4 days, the resurrection still occurs. And I also think that this gives us a preview in how people are going to respond, right? There are going to be people who, in light of the resurrection, are going to be moved to believe. and there are going to be people who, what they're going to do is report it to the Pharisees, right? They're not going to be softened by the announcement of Jesus' resurrection eventually. Okay, you want to take us to the next little section?
Where's your stop at?
Mine goes all the way to 53, but if you just want to finish the chapter, that'd be fine too.
Okay. In 47, it says, therefore the chief priests and the Pharisees convened a council meeting, and they were saying, what are we doing in regard to the fact that this man is performing many signs? If we let him go on like this, all the people will believe him, and the Romans will come and take both our place and our nation. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all, nor are you taking account that it is in your best interest that one man die for the people, and the whole nation not perish instead. Now he did say this on his own, but as he was high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus was going to die for the nation. Not only for the nation only, but in the order that he might also gather together into one the children of God who were scattered abroad. So from that day on, they planned together to kill him. Therefore, Jesus no longer continued to walk publicly among the Jews, but went away from there to the region near the wilderness, into a city called Ephraim, and there he stayed with his disciples. Now the Passover of the Jews was near, and many went to Jerusalem from the country prior to the Passover in order to purify themselves. So they were looking for Jesus and saying to one another as they stood in the temple area, what do you think, that he will not come to the feast at all? And the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where he was, that he was to report it so they might go and arrest him. So we see here that after this display of power, many believed, but then there were some who went back and reported it to the Pharisees. And we kind of see this whole time why it's kind of been a question of why the Pharisees didn't believe, why they were trying to trap him, why they were trying to do this. And to me, when I read this, I kind of see their answer, because they're afraid that people are going to believe him and that they're going to lose their high place and they're going to become, overtaken by the Romans and they'll no longer matter. So their plan is, from this point, is to kill him. There's no longer trying to trap him with questions and things. They're on a mission to take him out and to kill him from this point on.
Yeah, notice they say this man is doing many signs, right? They're not denying that. And then also, let's see. Yeah, so they're trying to squelch the evidence as well. The fact that Caiaphas says this, that it's good for one man to die than for the whole nation, and how that's a preview, that he's saying the truth but doesn't even know what he's saying. He's saying it from kind of a wicked perspective, and yet it's exactly what God had intended to do, to accomplish. Anything else through however far you
No. I think that was it.
You got any comments? Anybody else? Questions or thoughts?
No, I want to go back up to resurrection of Lazarus for a second. It just kind of struck me in verse 39 where Martha speaks to Jesus, and I don't know it's this way, but that would be a painful thing to have to say about a family. And I just kind of imagine it. She just kind of comes up to him in a private moment, with her voice lowered, and tells him this.
Yeah. Yeah. So can we notice something there? So going back to all that. So look at verse 26. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord. I have believed you are the Christ, the Son of God, the one who comes into the world. Right? That is a very bold, I say bold, it's a very weighty declaration of faith. She calls him Lord, Christ, Son of God, the one that was promised that's coming into the world. Then he says, remove the stone. And even as she pushes back, notice how she calls him Lord. And then he says in verse 40, didn't I say that if you believe? I wonder if here the benefit for her, so I talked about that, like he says, we waited so that. I wonder if the benefit for her is he's going to strengthen her faith. Because it's kind of like Peter when he confesses that Jesus is the Christ, and then Jesus says, I'm going to the cross. He goes, oh no. And Jesus says, get behind me. I wonder if something similar is happening here. He's saying, do you believe? And she says, absolutely. And then he calls for something that seems unreasonable, right? This doesn't seem like a why. And he goes, didn't I say if you believe? Because she's using the word Lord, and she's using the word Christ or King, and she's saying, I know you're the one. but then the way that she reacts kind of demonstrates that maybe she doesn't have the full confidence that she needs to have. And I wonder if this is Jesus' way of saying, hey, remember what you said, remember what you believe, remember who I am. And then they remove the stone, he's raised from the dead. And I have to imagine that Martha would say, whatever he says ever again, I'm just going to listen. Like this would absolutely be confirming to her. So I wonder if that's part of the reason why they've been committed to it. They have a close relationship. Let's ratchet that up a little bit, and the resurrection is going to make that happen. All right, so now Jesus has kind of backed off the scene. We're going to look at Matthew 19, Mark 10 in a couple of times. The next time we look is in Luke 17, and we're going to go all the way through 18, verse 14, if we can do that. And remember, we've got Jerusalem in view, and we're headed that direction over the next couple of weeks. Thank y'all very much for your kind participation, and I apologize to Lydia for my insensitive remark.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact